Daily Detroit is brought to you by the community. Support our work at patreon.com/dailydetroit.
Hello and welcome to your Daily Detroit. I'm Jer Stays, and on today's show, Thursday, November 21st, 2024, we're going to be talking about I-375. This project has the potential to make a lot of change in greater downtown Detroit. We're going to talk about it. Let's just jump into it. Joining me at the table at TechTown is none other than Eric Larson, CEO of the Downtown Detroit Partnership. Longtime listeners will know that this is not your first time to the studio, but your first time to our studio at TechTown. Welcome back.
I love being back, and I love being here at TechTown. What a great location. What a great living room to broadcast all the great things that are happening in Detroit. So thanks for having me back. It's been a little bit.
Yeah, it has been. I ran into you at the NFL draft real quick, but it's something where you have just been busy on so many projects that the Downtown Detroit Partnership does. But today, we are here to talk about I-375, a project that's caught not only the city's imagination, but the regional imagination, because downtown Detroit is in so many ways Metro Detroit's downtown that everybody shares, as well as some national interest as well. I remember I did a piece a few years ago for Detroit Public Television that got picked up nationally, because there's so much interest in the idea of removing a freeway. So, Eric, why don't we start at the very beginning? Why are we removing a freeway? Because I'll put stuff out about this, whether it's Instagram stories or pieces in our newsletter. And the first thing will be like, why are we getting rid of a freeway? So why don't we start there? Why are we looking to reimagine instead of just like slapping some new bridges on it?
Well, as you and I have talked, this sort of revisioning started, quite frankly, as just an infrastructure project to repair a few bridges along I-375. And that was 20 years ago when MDOT realized that they had some aging infrastructure. It became part of their 5-year planning cycle. That was 5 years, 20 years ago. So we've had 4 of those 5-year planning cycles. But the whole idea back then was just keep what's there, keep the depressed freeway, improve the bridges to get across, and maybe do a little bit of improvements in terms of some different mobility and so forth. But it wasn't to re-envision the way we think about not just the I-375 freeway, but also how we are starting to re-envision the downtown. What is the sort of the trajectory of our transportation? What is the city doing in terms of really repairing and reconnecting certain neighborhoods? And so now, fast forward, that's where we are, and that's what MDOT and the city and now the Downtown Detroit Partnership have been talking about.
There have been a few iterations of this. Why is the Downtown Detroit Partnership as involved as you are at this stage?
Well, there's 2 reasons. One, we are always looking to be that balanced voice and look at any opportunity as more than what the opportunity on its surface looks like. With 375, this could be just an infrastructure project. It could be just a fix the road kind of project. But the reality is this city not only deserves, but is actually expecting us to take these kinds of not only large expenditures, but also these major interventions in our downtown and do more with them. And so for the partnership, it's part of our stewardship of the core of our city. So anything like this, the Downtown Detroit Partnership wants to be involved in, especially when it comes to revisioning how we can move the city forward. As far as the sort of evolution from just fixing a couple bridges and now actually getting engaged with a peer review, the reason we're here now is because the federal government in 2017 made a commitment. The Biden administration had a reconnecting communities effort coming out of the pandemic. They committed $105 million that all of a sudden made 375 not only a funded project, but a real project. So MDOT then realized that they needed to continue to finalize these plans. And so from 2017 to date, they have been revising their thoughts. And as you said, over that 20-year period, at one point it had a parking structure under it as the 375 was raised and boulevarded. And other times it actually was thought of just leave it as it is and repair the bridges and maybe change some of the road configuration. Now, what 375 represents is not only a very innovative approach to a freeway that, quite frankly, in the 50s and 60s dissected major communities in the downtown and really had a very, very negative impact on a lot of our Black business and residential population in both Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. But it also is an opportunity to think about what is the mode of transportation. Are we going to continue to have the same levels of individual vehicles on the road? Or are we going to start to think about moving people around differently? How do we create a more walkable environment? How do we start to address some of the environmental conditions? So all of that is sort of where we are in current day. And a lot of that is through the vision, starting with the Biden administration, through Pete Buttigieg as the Secretary of Transportation, and their interest in reconnecting and repairing, quite frankly, some of the harm that was done back in the 50s and 60s, from the Highway Act.
So is this money programmed at this point? Would a change in administration affect that at all?
Would not. Great question. So this money has been appropriated. It is committed. And so there is no ability to claw back this money. There are other projects, obviously, that have been considered at the national level that may or may not continue. But this money is committed. It is also part of MDOT's 5-year funding commitment and their investment strategy. From a local level, that is committed. And then, there has been significant, as you and I've talked and your listeners have seen, there's significant commitment, not only at the federal level, but the governor, our mayor, all stood there and said, this is a project that's going to move forward. This is a project that's important for not only our city, but as you put it, for our region.
One thing that these proposals, I believe there's a few different looks that are involved in this, is talking about restoring the street grid. There is a concern that I have heard from some, especially visitors, going, well, I'm going to a Lions game. I'm going to Blue Cross Blue Shield. Is traffic at a state where we could take it to a street grid where we don't necessarily need that kind of high capacity freeway anymore? Because that's one concern that has been often raised. Is like, how are we going to deal with the traffic for these special events?
Yeah, and I think there's two things to how we deal with large volume traffic events. And one of it is, how much optionality do you have in the street grid? So, yes, in a perfect world, you could consider restoring everything back to the original street grid, the way it was when we had 2 million people living in the city of Detroit before the Highway Act, and really dispersing all of that activity and that load over a number of streets as opposed to just trying to get it all onto one highway. So that's one strategy. That's not the strategy that I think, is going to be pursued here. It's going to be a blend. It's going to be a blend of continuing to have the strength and capacity of a highway network, but also reduce it and actually make it much more pedestrian friendly. But the other piece to this is we don't necessarily need to build for just those high peak events. We need to build a city that actually is living and working for the people every day in every sort of situation. And so a lot of what we need to do around the events is make sure that we're thinking about those, we're planning those, we're looking at traffic modeling to make sure that we're making informed decisions, but also start to think about how can we have a better approach to traffic management? What are some of the things that other cities are doing around large events to move traffic? What are some of the things that we can do in terms of, think about, a Michigan game. All of a sudden, Main Street is, 5 lanes going one way and 1 lane going, the path of least resistance. So what are those kinds of solutions that are more temporary around a large scale event versus building a network of roads just for that large event?
So you could flex the infrastructure that's there depending on what's needed for that Sunday. Because Lions games are only so often. Yes, there are concerts at Ford Field, but when they're happening, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of what we have been doing with the peer review, and just to give you a little bit of flavor as to what the Downtown Detroit Partnership has been doing for the last 12 months, is we've been working with a group of really world-class consultants. Urban AC, which is led by Tony Griffin. You may remember Tony. She led the Detroit Future Cities and has a strong history here in the city of Detroit. Tool Transportation, and then HR&A, who also has spent a lot of time here in the city looking at economic and social impacts. That team, supported by Kresge, led by DDP, has been looking at best practices around the country and around, quite frankly, the world. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is make sure that we're blending what ultimately is a responsibility by MDOT. MDOT has certain responsibilities. They have responsibilities in terms of the capacity of traffic that can move. They have responsibilities to keep roads repaired. They have responsibility for safety. Those responsibilities are both at the state level as well as at the federal level. But what we're trying to do is say, okay, there are ways to achieve that, but all of those kinds of issues and responsibilities, but still be innovative, still be thoughtful, still create a situation where, for instance, with I-375 being raised and boulevarded, captures 30 additional acres of land, use that land and configure that land so that there is actual value both monetarily, but also socially.
One of the reasons it seems like we're in this peer review process is kind of the back and forth between the different stakeholders. One of those stakeholders is the Lafayette Park neighborhood, which a number of residents have raised concerns throughout the process. What are some of the things that you all have taken into account or are thinking about in this peer review going forward? Because I've noticed and gotten from listeners that There's some people who like this, and there's some people who are have a lot of questions about making sure they can stay connected to the hospitals. And, there's a lot of families in that neighborhood. There's a lot of people who are very connected to the city there.
The Lafayette Park community has been not only an incredible stakeholder and a key stakeholder in this process, but in many processes, but so has the surrounding business community and obviously the sports and entertainment. And so what the Downtown Detroit Partnership does and has continued to try and do through this peer review is balance all of those different perspectives and balance that view. But in terms of the Lafayette Park constituency and the residents that live there, there were a couple things that they were concerned with. I mean, if you boulevard I-375, bring it to grade and have 9 lanes, basically think about telegraph, that is not a more pedestrian friendly. That is not a more connected. That is not.
I would argue that telegraph is worse for pedestrians than what is there now. Having a lot of friends and having formerly lived in the Lafayette Park neighborhood.
Well, and that's a great point. And that's actually what the Lafayette Park neighborhood was saying is just leave what's there now and let us cross over these bridges, which are significantly more safe and easier to cross over, east and west, than to boulevard and make us do Frogger over 9 lanes of on-grade boulevard. So that was part of what we started talking about. And in working in a coordinated effort with MDOT and the city, we actually have made progress in that design. That design now is 6 lanes and in some cases 5 lanes. And so that's now starting to get to a scale that is much more pedestrian friendly. If you think about the ability to create protected bike lanes, much more tree-lined walkable streetscape, all of those things make it not only safer, but also make it much more inviting and create a better environment. And so I think that the Lafayette Park community is feeling better about where we are today relative to the boulevard. There are still questions about, you raised the access to hospitals, for instance. Right now it's super easy to jump on 375, go up 2 exits and jump off at Mac and get to, DMC or Henry Ford or any of the medical facilities that we have just to the north of us. But the reality is our plan and working with MDOT with what we presented actually provides more options. So you no longer have to just rely on 375. You actually can use the existing street grid. You can move north and south on more forms of egress than you can currently. And so that has been a big part of our plan is, again, what we're trying to say is you don't necessarily need to put everything on one road. If you really think about this and think about where the traffic demands are, you can spread that demand and you can actually create a much better environment.
One concern a number of listeners have brought up, because I was asking our member-only Discord about things that they're thinking about, is speed through that newly designed boulevard. What kind of things will you be doing to help mitigate so it just doesn't become... It's a challenge a lot of Detroiters face. I live near a 4-lane, one-way road that when there are cars on it, it's a speedway. How do you work to slow that down and deal with those concerns?
Yeah, and part of it is obviously just some of the normal interventions that MDOT will be providing, whether it's signal, crossings, stop signs. Obviously, there'll be a component of policing that will be necessary. But part of what this opportunity provides is just a calming of that sort of overall intensity. When you start to, put the road on a diet, people start to sort of slow down. They actually start to realize that this is more of a neighborhood, an urban core that they're driving through. Now, that won't apply to every person. And so, again, you have to make sure that you've got not only the safety implications, but also the policing there to take care of that. I really think that the study that we have done starts to make sure that people understand that if you're going a quarter of a mile and you're going at 60 versus 30, the amount of time that you're making up going 60 is relatively inconsequential because it is a short distance. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about a 1.5 mile stretch, most of which people aren't going the full 1.5 miles. And so even if we're slowing it down, we're not really extending the commute time. We're not really changing people's ability to get to and from places. What we're doing is just changing a perspective. We're starting to retrain the way people think about not only the use of our roads, but also the way that we want to engage with the city. And that's a healthy thing. It's the same kind of idea that many cities around the country are starting to face, not only because the Highway Act did dissect a lot of really important neighborhoods, but also because urban centers want to be more 24/7. They need to be more 24/7. We've come out of a pandemic where we don't have the same level of office participation on a regular basis. So how do we start to make up that? We make it up by increasing our residential and our visitor population, not looking away from the office demands, but complementing those. And all of these kinds of interventions, all of these improvements, all of these innovations start to help build an environment that is much more attractive to live in.
There are some concerns in the community around businesses and the impact that'll have. I stayed up by Livernois when they redid that with the bike lanes and everything else. What kind of impacts do you see and supports do you see for this project, which, by the way, if I understand correctly, is coming down the line? Like, it looks like this would actually start to break ground next year, correct?
Yeah, MDOT's schedule currently is to break ground at the end of this year with full construction starting in 2026. So it is coming, and it's coming quickly. And part of our report, our peer review, was broken down into 3 sections. The first section was all about the opportunity. We can't miss the fact that there's an incredible opportunity here to do something different. Detroit has been a living laboratory. We've been demonstrating to the world that Detroit is thinking about its built environment and the way that we service our community in different ways. We've been able to really be innovative. We've been able to try things that other places haven't been able to try. And this is another example of that. So what are the opportunities to not only repair some of the damage, but what are the ways to create better equity? What are some of the things that people can actually participate in? And so thinking about that additional land that's created, what does that land want to be? And the city has now brought on consultants to do a land use and zoning plan that is going to be very important for the community to be watching and following, because that's a place that not only affordability, but inclusion and access can be created. Then our second section was really about the design. We've talked a lot about the design already. And there are still some things that we have made recommendations in order to continue to improve. And we're working with MDOT and the city to continue to pursue those and to consider those. And then the third section was really about the mitigation, which is what you just talked about. It would be an absolute disaster. It would be the wrong outcome if we ultimately end up repeating a lot of the harm that was done back in the 50s and 60s. So what we've spent a lot of time is looking at best practices. You talk about Livernois and 6. That was a great example of a very concentrated mitigation plan. It was part communication, it was part monetary support, and a lot of it was phasing of that construction work. We also did that for M1. But there are other communities around the country and around the world that also have dealt with major projects like this that span a period of 3 years that will impact businesses. And so we're having those conversations. We provided a good roadmap to start from. The MDOT has now onboarded their progressive design build team. Their progressive design build team will start, now planning not only the staging and the phasing of the construction, because it is a progressive build, so it allows you to build it in sections. It's not going to be all at once, so there are ways to mitigate some of the impact. It won't mitigate all of it. They also are going to be looking at their mitigation plan. That mitigation plan will need to be augmented by some of the kinds of work that the Downtown Detroit Partnership and many of our partners do. We will have a mitigation plan. The next piece is everybody should take a look at the peer review. It's available. It's on our website at downtowndetroit.org. But they also should be participating in these community conversations. We want people to be talking about what are their concerns. We've already talked to a number of the major businesses, Greektown, Eastern Market, obviously Blue Cross Blue Shield, Greektown Casino. Those are all communities and businesses that are going to be impacted, even outside of the residential. And then the sports and entertainment needs to really think about what does that look like and how do we deal with that.
So this process, as I understand it, there are kind of 3 major buckets that you're looking at as far as how to configure this project. And I assume that's part of this community engagement portion, is to understand kind of which way things will kind of go. Can you talk about those 3 possibilities?
Well, the 3 possibilities, we're really looking at different typologies around use. And so if you think about core business, residential, sports and entertainment, there are different ways to think about road infrastructure and the services of those different demands. Our focus is the downtown has every one of those. And so it's really not about picking one over another. It's about trying to figure out what is the best blend of servicing all of that. How do you make sure that a residential community like Lafayette continues to feel like it's a residential community, that it's a neighborhood, that it has the kind of tree line, safe and attractive layout of street grid that is conducive to a walkable community. And then on the other side, you've got Blue Cross Blue Shield, for instance, that has 10,000 parcels of mail a day that have to get, serviced out of their facility. So it's that blend. You've got, you've already mentioned, things like the Lions and the run that they're on and the kind of, demand that the sports and entertainment venues to attract. So it's really less about picking winners and losers over those different uses. It's more about making sure that we've got a strategy that blends and allows for sort of a more balanced approach to all of that. I think where we will ultimately land is with, again, what we have suggested is more optionality as opposed to less. Let's not think about the fact that we have to put all of this on one road, one highway, one interchange. Let's think about how we can actually create better connections. Are there things that we can do with the service drives that allow those to actually be a feeder to a lot of this activity? Are there additional surface street road network that can be created? And also, what are the current street grid that we can tie into? So all of that has been explored. All of that has been then weighed against traffic counts and modeling. And we think there are ways. The other thing I think that's really important to think about this is, to the north, you have Brush and Brewster communities. Not only are an already existing neighborhood, but it's also a large contiguous tract of developable land. To the south, you have the old Wayne County jail site. That's another big developable land. Ford Field and Comerica Park are 20-year-old sports and entertainment facilities. They're getting to their point where they need to start revision and think about what is in their best interest, not only to continue to service their business, but also the surrounding communities. So this road network should be thinking about all of that. It should be thinking about, how do we connect east and west, north and south? How do we make sure that the opportunities for continued development not only support the development that's necessary, but also provide access through affordable housing or through community development funds or anything like that, that wouldn't be there without this project. And so again, for the Downtown Detroit Partnership, we just want people to think about this more than a road project.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned those communities, Brush Park and the like, also separate. I'll make sure the listeners understand, separate from this 375 project, there's a little bit of confusion around the 75 caps that have been talked about. One question I have from our listeners is, why aren't the two of them coordinated? Or is that because they're in different phases? Or what are your thoughts on the two of those things kind of working together?
Yeah, it's a great question, because they actually ultimately have to work together, because I-75 connects directly to not only the interchange that services 375, but then, obviously to North 75. And so we are actually looking at those in a coordinated effort. They are separated because one is following the timeline and the funding that is already in place for 375. So I-75 is still very much in its study phase. What we've been able to do is secure some very important federal funding, both at the city level and at DDP, to work with MDOT and the city to think about, what does the community want in terms of a connection? Is it one large cap? Is it a series of caps that relate to the neighborhoods and the activities that are on either side of 75? And they are going to need to be coordinated. I mean, the east end of 75 and the west end of I-375 and the interchange are one of the caps that's being considered around the Brush Avenue street bridge. That's another bridge that ultimately needs, to be repaired. So do we take that opportunity and maybe think about it as more part of the 375 project, but yet then continue to plan out the rest of the 75 more to the south? So those are the things that are happening. And I think it's very interesting. 375 started 20 years ago. I-75, basically started 3 years ago. A lot of it came out of the community benefits activities around the district. It was one of the things that the community expressed the greatest interest in.
Oh, really?
And
Okay.
So that concept...
Because people have asked me, where does this come from?
Yeah, that was sort of its origin. I mean, if you really want to go back to, and you and I've talked a little bit about this, when I was at Olympia, we were looking at LCA and the planning for that, and there was interest in connecting across I-75 between, obviously, the Fox and LCA, and there was a little cap that we were thinking about right at the Woodward crossing. So there were some concepts that go back, to the planning of LCA and before that. But the real interest came out of the community benefits work that the district, both Olympia as well as Related, did with the community. And one of the principal concepts that came out of interest was these caps and an ability not only to connect east and west, but also to reduce some of the environmental impact, noise, obviously, sort of overall environmental conditions are improved when it's capped, but also create some green space. I mean, the city has done an incredible job of being true to this 10-minute walk concept. And if you look at that section of the downtown, there isn't a lot of respite, there isn't a lot of green space, there isn't a lot of park space. And these caps allow us to create some very interesting community space on top of them and reclaim some real estate that currently doesn't exist or claim some real estate that doesn't currently exist and purpose that for the public.
And to be clear, for listeners, these are two separate projects, two different ways of funding them. So you still would have to find money for the caps, right? That's not programmed money yet.
Correct. On December 3rd, MDOT will have its next community meeting on I375, another great place for the community to engage. But you're right, they're two different projects. 375 is fully funded. 375 is about 30% designed over the next 12 months. The design will be finalized and construction will start on 375. So time is of the essence to continue to provide input, to let MDOT hear what is important to the surrounding community. This is a project that is going to live on for the next 60, 70, 100 years. And so getting it right now and thinking about what future demands might be and considerations is really critical at this point. And that's what the Downtown Detroit Partnership has not only been trying to drive through our peer review, but also to help the community engage in ways that maybe they haven't been able to in the past. And then on I-75, we have planning grants that will allow us to get to a place where we can then have a conceptual design at a stage that then we can apply, and when I say we, it would ultimately be MDOT, can apply for federal funding to allow for the build out of those caps. So the first phase is to finalize the design, understand what the community really wants, do some conceptual pricing, understand what the ultimate vision is, and then apply for construction funding.
And to be clear, so this federal funding is the kind of funding that would be targeted for this kind of project? Because, some people will ask, like, well, Detroit has a lot of needs. Why are we putting money towards an I-75 cap when we still have, a third of buses that are still in the maintenance shed some days? And so I think we should talk about, just for a second, those are two different buckets of money. Is that, this is separate thoughts? I want to talk about that because I think a lot of listeners get frustrated where they're like, hey, I have this need over here. Why are we doing this thing downtown? To cut straight to the chase.
Yeah, and it is two different buckets. And there are a lot of things that we continue to look at the partnership, as well as the city continues to look at in terms of funding. This administration, especially with the Biden administration in Washington, has been very successful in attracting a lot of different programs that have funded very important needs within the city of Detroit. And that will be a strategy that continues with the local administration, both at the state level as well as at the federal level. But the dollars that we're talking about in terms of the highway system are really federal highway appropriations. And there are different programs within the Federal Highway Administration. Federal Highway Administration has reoccurring grants for states and communities around the country that are continuing to improve the highway network, the road network that they're responsible for. And that's always in partnership with the local Department of Transportation and in the Michigan Department of Transportation. And so there are applications for those. It's a competitive process. There's only so much money, and those funds, get circulated. Sometimes administrations, like with the Biden administration, they have special projects. Coming out of the pandemic, there was a focus around reconnecting communities, reinvesting in some of the past harm and really trying to correct some of that. That program may or may not continue in this next administration. It may not get additional funding. So those are the things that we look at. Priorities change. Priorities change at the federal level. Priorities change at the state level. What we're trying to do, both in coordination with the city as well as just our everyday responsibility at the Downtown Detroit Partnership, is make sure that at the federal level and at the state level, they're never losing focus of the city of Detroit and all of the needs that we need. So you're absolutely right. We have a really unique opportunity to think about our overall transportation system and the overall transportation network. It's not just the road network, it's also the mass transit. And what are we doing to continue to improve that? There's a very important conversation coming up on Michigan Avenue. Michigan Avenue has a unique opportunity to be repositioned around some very innovative activity that's taking place up and down that corridor. What does the community want to see for Michigan Avenue? And what about that transformation includes a different way of approaching the way we get around? I mean, the self-charging mile of roadbed is sort of an example of that. Are we looking at dedicated bus lanes so that we can actually create some higher speed? And it isn't just roads. I mean, think about the conversation that's taking place about restoring some of the rail service. All of those things are things that have to be not only driven locally at the city level, but then have opportunities for funding and additional support both at the state and federal level.
All right. So 375, that's the thing right ahead of us. What is the next big public opportunity for people to be heard, and what can they do to learn more if they want to learn more?
So again, I would encourage anyone that is interested, and everyone should really be interested. And it doesn't matter whether you're living in the city of Detroit, visiting, coming to a game, or considering, making an investment. These are important decisions that are being made. So I would encourage everyone to go to our website, downtowndetroit.org, and take a look at the peer review. There's a lot of great information. And quite frankly, it's information that we believe other communities will be able to leverage. I mean, one of the things that we've been working very closely, not only with our consultants, but with Kresge, is to make sure that this story that's taking place in Detroit can get told nationally, because there are a lot of other communities that not only we've looked at, places like the Anacostia River crossing in DC, things like Roanoke, Minneapolis. Those are examples of other communities that are wrestling with the exact same thing that we've been talking about here today. But the next big step is December 3rd. MDOT will continue to have a series of public engagements. The public engagements will start to pull in their progressive design build team. That progressive design build team needs to be hearing through MDOT, but also through the community, what some of the continued opportunities are, what some of the concerns are. We know that this is never going to be perfect in everyone's eyes, but we have a responsibility as a community and as a city to make sure we get it as perfect as we can. And that's where the balance of really hearing what's needed and then trying to apply that in this built environment is what we're doing.
I will put a link to all of that in the show notes. Eric Larson, CEO of the Downtown Detroit Partnership. Thank you for coming on Daily Detroit. I always appreciate you.
I always love being with you. This is great. It's so fun. Thank you again.
All right. You got feedback? Let me know. dailydetroit@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around Detroit.